Actually, no, we're doing all right for time. So, historical precedent. These ideas don't come out of a complete vacuum. And what I'm building toward, I'm only going to talk about this for a little bit, but the thing is, what I'm building toward is that when people judge these ideas, a lot of their judgments are coming from gut reactions. You know, they're coming from often quite implicit worldview stuff they have about not only the way the world is or the way the world could be, but the way it should be. And sometimes the best way to get at what someone's worldview is to look at how they relate to where these ideas have come from. You know, do you know who you inherited these ideas from? You might have come across them in a particular internet article or a book or even a song or something that sparked your enthusiasm, but where did that person get the ideas from? And you often find that a lot of the baggage that comes with it, some of the aesthetics, are actually quite ideologically loaded. So, just very quickly, a couple of very, very, very broad areas. We're talking about the 50s and 60s. We've got Alan Turing doing a lot of work that I imagine anyone, I mean, can I have a quick show of hands who knows who Alan Turing is? Okay, all right, you all know who Alan Turing is. And he...
There was one or two hands you didn't got, maybe.
Yeah, all right, well, sorry. Yeah. Okay, basically Alan Turing is sort of this recognised after the fact pioneer of artificial intelligence who was a mathematician, a computer scientist before there was such a thing as computer science, who a lot of his work was secret because he worked on cracking the Enigma machine during the war, the German cryptography. And he at the time was working on a lot of ideas that were basically hypothetical notions of how artificial intelligence might develop in the future. And artificial intelligence originally was quite modestly described as, I paraphrase, but essentially getting machines to do things that if they were done by a human would be considered intelligent. Okay? And at the time that was a lot of sort of very prescribed behaviour like winning chess games or checkers before that. Alan Turing came up with the what later became known as the Turing test, which was essentially to say, he was saying, what does it mean to say that a machine can think? And it was sort of a teasy title of a paper because essentially he backed off and said, well, you can't. You can't know if the machine's thinking, but what we can know is whether or not you think it's thinking. So the whole idea of the Turing test is to set up a situation where we're seeing if you had a conversation with this machine and just by looking at it, you're sat at a turn or something, you couldn't know if it's a machine on the other end of the line or a person, would after a certain amount of conversation you believe that this could as easily be a person as a machine. Now, around the same time, well, actually shortly after, the Dartmouth conferences, we've got people like Marvin Minsky, who are also movers and shakers of very early AI. They're starting to bring people together who are talking about AI in these same terms. You know, what do we do? What do we have to do to make a machine do things that if a person did them, we call it intelligent? And they're an optimistic bunch. They generally people, maybe the real core people weren't quite so carried away, but just about anyone who talked about this kind of thing over the next couple of decades thought there was going to be the massive AI breakthrough of human equivalent intelligence in machines any day now. It'll all be over by Christmas. It wasn't. But those ideas led within AI to what later became known as the AI winter, which is, so there was this massive, it's the typical boom and bust scenario where there was this massive injection of military and corporate funding. People expected returns from AI any day now, and then it all dropped off for a long time, and people started turning around and saying AI is an unachievable goal. It's a waste of money and time. Okay, so around the same time, so 50s coming into the 60s, you've got other stuff going on in the arts that is more broadly relevant to virtual reality. Now at the time, no one had heard of virtual reality. You've got one or two pioneers like Ivan Sutherland coming up with their ideas in obscure, well, from the point of view of the general populace, obscure academic matters. But you do have one or two interesting things that have kind of fed into what later became AI. So you've got the Beats, who were authors, poets, occasionally visual artists and musicians, mostly in America, one or two in other places, Britain particularly, who they were having sort of impromptu events where the idea, it was very similar to Hakim Bey's later idea of of a temporary autonomous zone. The idea was to create a space that, for a night or for a week or whatever, had its own rules. Now, this is obviously not a new idea to the Beats, but they were sort of dusting off an idea that had been around before the war. And a lot of the Beats ideas, even though they were incredibly new, rough ideas, they fed into what became the hippies a few years later. All the early hippies loved Jack Kerouac, William Burroughs, that kind of thing, and they dragged all those ideas forward. And you got a lot of what was happening in the 60s was, on a popular level, the more beat name for it was happenings. So it was, I want to say it's a little like a flash mob, but essentially it was more controlled and more contrived, and that you get together people in a room who would try to create something. Or sorry,
hang on. Here, you've got the perfect example. We're sitting in the middle of a temporary autonomous zone.
Well, exactly. Yeah. But and, you know, these kind of happening type scenarios they were obviously more sort of arts oriented, and they were meant to be less hierarchical. So it wasn't one person telling everyone else a bunch of stuff. It was more like you'd bring things together and make stuff happen. And quite often what they'd do is set up stations around the room. So you'd have, you know, I want to use cartoony examples. You'd have your bongos over there, and you
reminds me of the modern idea of hackerspaces.
Well, exactly. Yeah. And these things are, you know, there are precedents and then there are developments. So they were doing this kind of thing, and around the same time, particularly in the States, you've got, in the art world, you've got installation art. The idea that an art object doesn't just have to be a sculpture, or and again, all these things have precedent going back to the start of the century and even before fantasy. But basically, the idea that you can create a room, set a room or a space, and whatever happens inside that space is the art. Sometimes it was kind of similar to painting or sculpture. There'd be a lot of paint or clay or whatever being splashed around. Sometimes it was more performative. So, you know, whatever the people did or said over that space of time was the art. And then there were big questions about conceptualism. I mean, was it still art if you hadn't recorded it? Was it the recording of what happened in that room that day, the art, or was it just the happening? The recording is just a document. So basically, you've got scientists playing with ideas about what the mind is. You've got artists and just kids basically playing with ideas of what happens if you all get together in a room and say that this is our space, we're going to do something with it. And a bunch of time goes by. And people get simultaneously, you know, develop ideas, but on the other hand get more cynical, and some of these ideas seem so old that there's no point in doing anything with them. But basically the one key thing that happened over this 20 years was processing power. A lot of processing power developed. If you're the kind of person who reads much into this kind of thing, you've got the low foothills of exponential development of processing power. Computers started to be able to do interesting stuff. So the AI winter's coming to an end, and what that means is that even though people are still telling you that AI doesn't exist anymore, AI never worked, AI never will work, you've suddenly got a little low-level applications, often embedded in other applications, that do the stuff that the guys back in the 50s wanted to be able to do, and a lot more besides.
Excuse me, is this psychedelia?
Oh yeah, okay. Sorry, I did too. You're quite right. Okay, so if we could go back a little bit. Related to the happenings, actually really quite closely related. This was an important one, thank you very much. This kind of stuff with the happenings, all the kids getting together in the room, the artists, it was related to psychedelia later, the sort of big explosion of sort of psychedelic stuff in public consciousness in the late 60s, mainly through one person. That was Timothy Leary. Can I have another quick show of hands? Who knows Timothy Leary? Okay, slightly fewer, but you know, still quite a few. Timothy Leary was basically a disgraced psychologist, and then what happened was he was a psychologist who worked on models of behaviour, where behaviour was modelled as gameplay. Personal situation: his wife committed suicide, and so he left academia. After a while, he managed to speak to the people at Harvard who were setting up a new centre, and they said, we're really interested in what you do, and we're also really interested that LSD has been made legal for research purposes. Actually, it was legal, I think, full stop at the time. And he said, yeah, sure, I'd like to look into, you know, the applications of these drugs to my research about people's behaviour, interpersonal transactional psychology, I think it was called. And basically what happened was, over a short space of time, Leary met a lot of the beat poets and people through Allen Ginsberg. All these people have been getting together in rooms and just kind of causing chaos in the name of art and having fun and creating sort of these spaces that exist for a night,